Greetings, everyone. My name is Jonathan Cabeda, and on behalf of everyone here at Health Professionals Network for Tigray, thank you very much for being here for an important discussion. As you all know, obviously, this is the topic of the discussion is going to be Tigray, but we have great panelists, and thank you so much for all the panelists that have been here to really talk about the different atrocities that have happened in the past history. And most importantly, also, thank you for our sponsors, as well as our moderator, George Lopez, for really making this event come true. So you're going to hear a lot about HPN today. So I want to make sure that everybody knows who's the host here, what's HPN, and what do we do. HPN is a non-for-profit organization that really connects health professionals with a mission to heal and rebuild communities in Tigray and beyond. Unfortunately, this organization came alive when right shortly after the crisis in Tigray, but our goal is lofty, and certainly we want to build on what we've been doing over the last several weeks and months. So one of the ways that we get things done within Health Professionals Network, or HPN, as you're going to hear me say a lot, is we have several different committees that are structured to really get the work out into the communities and actually on the field. Several of the committees include women and children, chronic disease, as well as health resources mobilization, and last but not least, advocacy, and which is the group that I lead, and which is the group that really brought this event to you all. So first of all, thank you to all the folks that work on the advocacy and social media group that really made this event what it is today. So let's talk about why do we have this event, and why did we call it the way that we did, and what's the whole point? What's the action after all of this? Just to kind of take you back a little bit, the Holocaust happened actually in 76 years ago, 76 and 2 months ago, to be precise. That was the first time that phrase "never again" also came in light. And it was supposed to be a promise so that we don't repeat the mass atrocities that happened through that time. And since then, I hate to be the reminder, but we've seen that in just about short 10 days, we're going to be memorializing the genocide in Rwanda, and that would have been 27-year anniversary. And in addition, for the Rwanda, about April 6th, 1992 also marked the 31st anniversary of Bosnia conflict. Once again, the same sort of atrocities that have happened. And just this past month in March, we would be memorializing again the 10th year anniversary for the Syrian conflict. That's still ongoing, by the way. So as you're hearing this, you begin to get the sense that we've made this promise 76 plus years ago, and yet these mass atrocities continue to happen, and we continue to allow them to happen. So the hope and the objective for today is we've made this promise that we seem to not fulfill. How can we start at least checking the folks that are committing these atrocities, and how do we ensure that all of us who have voices today, you may not be Tigray, from Tigray today, or Bosnia or Syria, but you have a voice, and use that voice to really be heard and make sure that these perpetrators don't commit yet another mass atrocities. We know that today we only have few countries and few places and few events that we've brought. We also know that Yemen is in the same boat. Burmese are also feeling the same atrocities, and many more. So these histories are repeating themselves in various different places. And the hope for today is that we can stop that. So what's the action? So obviously, Health Professional Network is doing a lot of advocacy. We're trying to connect to the folks that are on the ground. But what is the exact action that we're going to take after all these discussions? And the call to action today, and you're going to see it in several slides later on today, is really threefold. One is cease hostilities and protect civilians. That's first and foremost. Reconnect Tigray and allow unrestricted humanitarian access. This is unfortunately a conflict that started at the heel of the US election, where the world was glued to the TV to really watch what was happening. And unfortunately, 5 months have gone on where not a lot of actions have come up. So what we're asking is reconnect Tigray so we can get what is happening on the ground, as well as really provide the unrestricted humanitarian access that they so direly need. And last but not least, there's no point in us continuing to send medical equipment, continuing to send aid and such, if the same perpetrators are going to be using the resources that we're sending to benefit them. So it is crucial for us to also push for allowing the UN-led based independent investigation into the mass atrocities and human rights violations that are happening today. So this is where your action part comes in. You've heard obviously what we do and what we're trying to do today, but what can you do today? And unfortunately, it doesn't take a whole lot of effort, or fortunately, it doesn't take a whole lot of efforts, and hopefully you can join us with this. And it's simple. We have a Twitter campaign that you're going to see later on in the middle of the presentation. And luckily, thanks to our social media group, as well as our partner Omna, we actually have a live 24-hour tweeting campaign with hashtag never again for Tigray. The 4 is a number, never again for Tigray. And what we hope to do is after the session today, you and during too, if you are not on your phone right now, please use that hashtag and be able to connect to the different organizations that definitely have a lot to say in stopping or alleviating these mass atrocities. Throughout, like I was saying before, in the middle of the presentation, we will have one Twitter that campaign that we're going to be asking everybody to pull their phone out and do that. But as I keep saying, this is where you can actually make an impact and use your voices so that you can change the outcomes of this event. And so before I introduce George Lopez, who's going to really kick us off to the rest of the panel discussion and such, just one housekeeping item. We realize, obviously, we have a lot of great panelists and a lot of people that also want to ask a lot of questions to the panelists. What we ask is to continue to send us your question through the chat function. And if we have time, we will certainly address those. But if we don't, this is not a sprint. This is going to be a marathon. And one of the ways that we're going to continue to engage with you is going to be perhaps inviting some of the panelists today so that we can continue to address some of your questions and hopefully that we can continue to engage. And we have obviously the web pages that you can continue to engage with us, as well as the social media pages. And last but not least, HPN need resources. And so we do have a page where you can also make a financial contribution so that these things are actually going to the health needs of those people that are on the ground suffering. So with that introduction, I'll go to George Lopez, our student moderator. George Lopez is a professor emeritus of peace studies at the Kroc Institute of International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Professor Lopez is a leading expert on economic sanctions, peace building, and various peace-related issues. He served as a vice president of the Academy for International Conflict Management and Peace Building at the U.S. Institute of Peace in Washington, D.C. And since 1992, Lopez has advised the United Nations as well as various international agencies and government regarding sanction issues, ranging from limiting their humanitarian impact to design and targeting financial sanctions. We're very fortunate to have George Lopez to really be the quarterback and the moderator of this with various expert panelists. And so with that, George, take it away.
Thank you so much, Jonathan, and thank you for this marvelous audience and our panelists who are here today to address these important issues. As we say, as the theme of the panel, never again should this happen, but let us learn from our experts today why that's been so difficult in the recounting and remembering of past atrocities, and also at the beginning for us to have the great advantage of getting an up-to-date and happening in Tigray. I'd like to begin by introducing all 5 of our panelists. Fortunately, we learned just before we began today that Gadete cannot join us and talk about the Rwandan experience, but we're going to start with some remarks from Alex and Maeza, and then move to our other 3 experts about each of their 3 particular experiences and their reflection. So let me begin by introducing Alex DeWall. And again, I'll go through all 5 of the panelists before I turn it over to Alex. Alex is the executive director of the World Peace Foundation and the research professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. He is clearly and rightly considered one of the great experts in the world and certainly in the United States about the Horn of Africa. His practice and his scholarship has probed humanitarian crisis, human rights concerns, HIV and AIDS, and governance in Africa. And he's been significantly involved in the problem of conflict and peace building. He also is the recipient of a number of awards from the Atlantic Monthly for 27 Brave Thinkers in 2019. And he's been considered by Foreign Policy as the 100 top intellectuals in 2018. Also joining him to speak about Tigray is Maza Gade. She is an international relations researcher, a human rights advocate, and a representative of Omna Tigray, one of the great co-sponsors of our event. Omna is a nonpartisan global organization that advocates for Tigrayans, but also other marginalized people. She's completed her undergraduate degree in South Korea, where she earned a BA in International Studies on a merit-based scholarship and graduated with honors. Our other panelists include Shelley Inglis, one of our hosts today. She is director of the Human Rights Center at the University of Dayton and a research professor of law and human rights at the University of Dayton. She came to Dayton from the United Nations Development Program, where she held various management positions working on peace building, governance, rule of law, and human rights. She also was affiliated with the Sustainable Development Agenda, working at UN headquarters in New York and regionally based as well in Istanbul, Turkey. Dr. Basil Terminini is the board member and former vice president of the Syrian American Medical Society, SAMS. Dr. Terminini is a fellowship trained and practicing GI physician. He serves as chairman of the Turkey Northern Syria Relief Committee, where he oversees the work of nearly 40 health facilities and 2,000 medical staff in Syria. Dr. Terminini has been actively involved in many of the milestones of SAMS as it's accomplished over the years, including the tripling of the number of medical personnel working in Syria. Dr. Juana Nestian Sandu is the International Program Director of the Olga Lengrel Institute for Holocaust Studies and Human Rights in New York, and also as Program Director of the Intercultural Institute at Timisoara in Romania. He has a PhD in social psychology and a vast experience at developing educational programs for teachers and youth in Europe, the United States, and MENA. She consults for the Council on Europe and the United Nations and finds the time to teach as well 2 undergraduate courses in intercultural education and civic education at West University in Timisoara. Thank you to each of you for taking the time today. The audience looks forward to hearing your expertise. Alex, I want to turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. It's a privilege to be with you. I wish I could say it's a pleasure, but the subject is so urgent and distressing that we don't really take any pleasure in what we are discussing. For some months now, one of the greatest crimes of our time has been unfolding in Tigray region of Ethiopia. And I get calls almost every day from Tigrayans wanting to speak to me. And I always am compelled to start my conversation with the words, "My condolences on your loss," because every single one of them has lost a close personal family member. I can no longer ask, "How is your family?" Sadly, with confidence, I can expect that the family is not okay. How many anecdotes, how many of these individual stories do we have to hear before we recognize that a great crime against humanity is being perpetrated? Now, it's being perpetrated in an extraordinary silence. And I want to spend just a few minutes looking at that silence. The silence began partly because the Western world had an enormous blind spot on Ethiopia. The assumption was that if someone came to power, like Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, promising liberal, democratic human rights reforms, he must be a good thing. He would be given the benefit of the doubt. And because he made peace with Eritrea, a government that is notoriously despotic, nonetheless, he made peace, and so he was given a peace prize. And that contributed to giving him the benefit of doubt that would not be afforded to other politicians. The silence that has unfolded, that has blanketed the war as it has unfolded, has been facilitated. It was facilitated by the Trump administration. It was facilitated by the negligence of embassies in Addis Ababa, and by a very, very effective campaign of concealing what is going on. It is extraordinary in the in the third decade of this century, that it is possible to conceal with such effectiveness crimes against humanity that are being perpetrated. They were concealed by shutting off phones and internet, by preventing journalists from having access, and humanitarian workers from having access, but more insidiously by various means of trying to control the narrative, by trying to put various checks on what is said. It's remarkable. I am in touch very often. In fact, I was in touch just even a few minutes ago with leading Tigrayans who I have known for decades, whose opinions I trust, who are in the field, who report in detail what is happening. And they can call out, you cannot call in. And I pass this information on to journalists, to editors, but they never use it. The reason being, it cannot be confirmed. They cannot make a phone call to confirm it, even though when I report something, it turns out to be accurate further down the line. It's as though one were to get a phone call made with great hazard, great personal risk and expense from a concentration camp. And the editor said, well, let me call the German embassy to see what they have to say about it. And if they don't confirm it, then I'm afraid we're not going to run with that story. In a similar sort of way, because there's not been humanitarian access, there has not been data for the numbers of children who are malnourished, for the lack of food in areas of rural Tigray. The humanitarians are not able to say this is famine or this is an extreme humanitarian emergency. But when we put the pieces of the picture together, what we see is extremely disturbing. What we see are a pattern of atrocities, a pattern of widespread and systematic killings, rape, torture, forced displacement. And what I want to focus on, particularly in the context of this panel, because this is health professionals, is starvation crimes. The prohibition of starvation in international criminal law in the Rome Statute is not just the deprivation of food. It's the deprivation of objects indispensable to survival. So that includes medicine. It includes water and sanitation. It includes maternal care for children. And in the longer term, a basic livelihood and employment. And what we have seen, increasingly systematically and well documented, is that the forces of the Ethiopian National Defense Force, militia from Amhara, and the Eritrean Defense Forces have been engaged in a campaign of relentlessly destroying, depriving, ransacking, looting those objects, destroying 3/4 or more of the health facilities. As I said, I was on the phone just a few minutes ago to close colleagues who are in the mountains of central Tigray, in the areas, the majority of the people are in areas controlled by the Tigray Defense Forces. Not a single malaria tablet. Hardly a clinic is functional. People have had most of their livestock stolen or slaughtered. They do not have seeds to plant. The season for ploughing the fields will begin in a few weeks. The rains will begin in 2 to 3 months. If those supplies, essential supplies for cultivation, are not provided, then they will not be able to plant. They will not have a harvest for the coming year. And the current crisis and the current welfare bill will be extended for yet another year. Just a few more points. One is that the lies told by the government of Ethiopia, by the Prime Minister, are slowly being dismantled. He said back in November that in what he called the law enforcement operation, not a single civilian had been killed. That is not true. Nobody believes it. He said it was a law enforcement operation and it was over. That is not true. The report that I was getting from people whom I trust tell us that in the last 3 weeks, there have been battles in which more than 5,000, they say 5,100 Eritrean troops were killed or seriously wounded. And comparable numbers, I'm sure, have died from the other forces too. So a very large-scale war is ongoing. Prime Minister Abiy said, no Eritreans there. He told the UN Secretary General and others. Then he admitted it. They are there. In fact, they are the ones doing most of the fighting, committing perhaps the majority of the atrocities. And he has said there will be accountability. I don't believe a word of it. One of the other interesting things that is emerging from anecdotes and from the documentation that is now being captured from the Eritreans and the Ethiopian National Defense Forces addresses the issue of intent. Why are they doing it? And I was just hearing within the last hour of a captured document with a radio communication between an Eritrean unit that had taken 300 head of livestock, oxen, cows, etc., and their commander. What shall we do with them? And the answer came back from the commander, kill them all, eat what you can, but just kill the remainder. We want to punish these people. We want to make sure they will never rise again. Where have we heard that before? As these data, as this information comes out, the obligations internationally are inescapable, I believe. And there is a very immediate obligation, which is the last point I'm going to make, which connects to the point that Jonathan made about reconnecting Tigray. The majority of the people in Tigray in need, more than 3 million, are outside areas that can be reached under the existing humanitarian operation. They desperately need food, medicine, they need seeds, they need fertilizers, they need everything in order to restart their lives. This is where the reconnection should start. It should not be left to the arbitrary whims of the government of Ethiopia, which, as we know, is incapable of telling the truth about what is going on, or it cannot be left to the ad hoc actions of those humanitarian workers who are there on the front line, who may be courageous, who may be capable. There has to be a coordinated attempt in close collaboration with the Tigray Defense Forces at a cessation of hostilities and humanitarian corridors. That is just the first step. The other steps, I'm sure, in terms of accountability, making sure that those who committed these crimes are called to account, etc., we can get to later on. Thank you.
Alex, thank you so much for that. So much in a short amount of time and so painful. Mayaza, may we ask you for your comments here from your experience in the work that you've been doing and the context that you have?
Thank you so much, first of all, for facilitating this. As a Tigrayan who was born and raised in Tigray, I have so many family members and friends, and also as a feminist who tried to involve in women empowerment initiatives back when I was in Ethiopia and also in Korea. I have so many contacts with feminist movements back on the ground as well. And the stories that I have been hearing from them are quite devastating. It's even hard to put them in words because this is something I have never ever heard of. This is something we have never experienced before as Tigrayans, although we have had several civil wars as Ethiopians collectively in our past history. Some of the things that I constantly hear from my source on the ground is that the weaponized rape, how women are being used as, battlegrounds. Their bodies is being degraded, they're being tortured and gang raped. One of the stories that really keeps me up at night is the story of a young lady called Lemlem. She's only 28 years old, and she's from a part of Tigray called Selakhlakha. She was on her way looking for, food, because there is shortage of food. People are being internally displaced, and so she was also on her way trying to find something for her family. And on the way, allegedly, or Eritrean troops found her. Over 23 of them gang raped her for about 10 days. The pain didn't stop there. After they finished gang raping her, they filled her body with sharp objects, such as nail and what have you. And this leaves a generational trauma, not only on her, but also on the people of Tigray collectively, because survivors of the weaponized her, like the weaponized rape, like Lemlem, they're also getting pregnant and having to give birth to a child that you didn't wish for, to a child of your raper, to a child of your someone that violates you, leaves you with a generational trauma that's never going to go away. And the trauma doesn't stop with them. It also reflects on the community. It also reflects on the doctors, on the nurses that are having to treat them with the very little resource they have at hand. So this is something that really keeps me up at night. But also to add to what Mr. Alex earlier said regarding the withdrawal of Eritrean troops, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, yes, 2 days ago, has made a public announcement, first of all, admitting that Eritrean troops are indeed within Ethiopia, particularly in Tigray. But he also announced that they will be withdrawing. However, today, this morning, I got a call from my sources on the ground telling me that Eritrean troops are actually not being withdrawn. They are rather coming into Tigray in more numbers, in masses. So new division of Eritrean troops are being deployed to Tigray as we speak. This is something that I got from people that are actually on the ground. And I believe this urges a UN mandated verifying mechanism, because with the Ethiopian government, particularly Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed of Ethiopia, we know him to make promises. We know him to say one thing and do completely another thing. So although because of the mounting pressure from the international community, he has finally admitted that there are indeed Ethiopian troops within Tigray causing havoc and destruction all over the region, and that they will be withdrawing. More people are coming, more troops are coming into Tigray. And these are troops that have been looting hospitals. These are troops that have been burning crops and destroying public infrastructures, and also causing pain and suffering upon the people of Tigray. So it's very, very important that the international community, particularly the UN, puts a mechanism that will enable them to verify and monitor the withdrawal of all invading forces, but most importantly, the Eritrean troops. Um, in addition to this, we have been hearing stories and reports from the various international aid workers that have been able to enter into Tigray with a very limited access. One of them is the Doctors Without Borders. I think couple of days ago, there was a report that they published stating how they have witnessed a massacre or killing of young men. These young men were dragged from a bus that was traveling en route, and then they were suddenly stopped on the road by soldiers, and then some of the men that were within that bus were shot dead. In addition to this, they have also reported about them saying health facilities being used, centers for injured soldiers. Both the Ethiopian army and Eritrean troops have been used public infrastructure such as clinics and hospitals that were supposed to serve innocent civilians. They changed them into military camps. They also vandalized and looted and burned all health equipment that could have used, to save, innocent lives during this dire times in Tigray. But that's not exactly what's happening on the ground. And it's mainly because the involvement of Eritrean troops, Ethiopian National Army, as well as the Amhara militias. So this kind of brings us to emphasis on the immediate need of international intervention within Ethiopia, because Ethiopia by itself is the enemy. It's the state that is causing or enabling others to cause most of the crimes that could allege to war crimes. So as a Tigrayan who was born and raised in Tigray, I feel the pain deeply, just like every other person. But I also urge the international community to do more, because all the concerns or the plea that has been made by global leaders doesn't seem really to get the Ethiopian government's attention. So the only way that the Ethiopian government could be forced into stopping the ongoing conflict and the pain of innocent lives in Tigray is if, a tangible measure is taken against it. And that's why we demand the US government and also all global leaders to take an action against the Ethiopian regime. But in addition to that, most of the time you would hear Tigrayan activists calling this a state-sponsored genocide. It's mainly because of the stories we hear from rape survivors. One of the stories that was covered on CNN recently reported that a survivor that is currently a refugee in Sudan, depicting story how she was raped by Amhara militias and how they were telling her that they were doing it in order to purify her bloodline, in order to, Amharanize her in a way. So there is the intent there. The intent is to exterminate the people of Tigray. And in order to achieve that, hospitals are being looted, health sectors are being destroyed and vandalized, crops are being burned, roads that would enable people to, flee the war zone and seek refuge in Sudan, a neighboring country, are being purposefully, closed or occupied by military men, and this by itself amounts to war crimes. So these are some of the things we hear and some of the things that are really concerning. And I hope the audience today will really, educate themselves further on this issue and find ways on how they can best help us in our collective efforts to stop the suffering of innocent lives that are perishing in the dark in Tigray, Ethiopia.
Thank you so much. The harking back to the same kind of problem attack, the violence against women, the attempt of a kind of ethnic cleansing harks back so much to the Bosnian conflict. And I think we can make a bridge, Mayaz, from your good comments to our other three panelists. Shelley and Basil and Oana, you each have some expertise and certainly experience in talking about and looking at the conflicts in these other areas. If our theme today is never again, what is the never that we should remember? What should we know about and learn from these past conflicts in particular ways? And before I ask Shelley to have us begin, I'd ask our slide manager to please put back up, for those who joined us, we have 117 participants. We had about 100 when we began. We'd like to remind you of who and how and what brings us together. This is a panel sponsored by HPN for Tigray. This is a panel in which we're trying to not only educate some of the human dimensions about what's happening in the tragedy, but hopefully to push many of you with new knowledge to new advocacy. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Shelley, please, for your comments.
Thank you, George, and thank you so much to all the colleagues, to Alex and others who are on this event and sharing their great wisdom, insight, and passion with us today. Indeed, the stories around violence against women, rape of women as a weapon of war, really does harken back to the experience in Bosnia. And of course, ethnic cleansing, the terminology, which is not an international crime, but is considered to be part of crimes against humanity, and can contribute to ultimately genocide, emerged during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia and Bosnia and Herzegovina. There's many things I can say because of the years that have passed with the Bosnian conflict that I'm going to say now, but that doesn't undermine the demands of this panel and the immediacy of some of those demands around humanitarian access and around immediate cessation of hostilities. But I am going to reflect a little bit more broadly on the lessons because of the years that have passed. And one of the things that I really want to pick up from the comments that were said is that women are usually the battleground for these kinds of conflicts, ethnically driven, nationally driven efforts to retain or to claim forms of power and control. And women are historically, as we know, the victims and survivors and in the post-war period, usually those who carry most of the burdens, but are not at the table in the discussions of the actual peace and the immediacy of the hostilities now. So what I think would be essential to take away from the Bosnia experience as a number one learning is that right now, women activists and women voices should be a part of the negotiations and the discussions around the cessation of hostilities. Their views should be clearly recognized by international organizations, by those who are going to take on leadership of US policy, and demanded of those organizations, of those who are in leadership positions with respect to Ethiopia, Sudan, Eritrea, and neighbors. So I think that's the first point. The second point is that obviously in Bosnia, what happened to stop the war was to ingrain ethnic identity and nationalist politics into the construct of the future of the country, which has stymied the country completely from moving towards meaningful democracy, meaningful empowerment, meaningful prosperity and development. And that we still continue to focus on and continue to have as a challenge today. And it feeds that warring powers, take on tools of war in order to claim power and then situate themselves in positions to retain that power. And usually then large forms of corruption and self-benefiting their groups and themselves become the main ways in which the country is governed. And those who are being governed are asked to place themselves in ethnic identities forever and really stymie civic engagement and the ability of people to move beyond ethnic conflict. And here is another great lesson of Bosnia that I think is extremely important as people start to think about how do we look at peace? What is the kind of peace that people who are invested in Tigray, in broader Ethiopia, in peace in that region want to see going forward? The last thing I'll say before turning it over, and maybe I have a few other points, but I don't want to, monopolize the conversation at this point. But I do think accountability is going to be a very important part of the equation. And we do have extraordinary lessons from Bosnia, Rwanda, and other countries with regard to accountability. Now that there will be an investigation by the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, along with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission, there's little doubt in my mind that they are going to be able to put forward clear evidence of violations of international law and mass atrocities already. Although at this point, we want to stop any greater disintegration and mass atrocities. There have already been mass atrocities committed, likely, and that will emerge. And so the question will be, what forms of accountability are put in place as this evidence emerges? Here in the Bosnian context, as many of you know, there was a very strong focus on the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, which was a very important and continues to have a very important far-reaching role in the development of international criminal law. And of course, was the tribunal that first recognized and held people accountable, perpetrators accountable for violations of rape as a war crime. However, it was a very narrow approach to accountability in the sense that it was only an international tribunal. And here we've learned a lot from Bosnia and many other places around being careful about and thoughtful and intentional about the various ways in which countries and communities, survivors and perpetrators need to come to account and address legacies of gross violations of human rights. And in accountability of perpetrators in international criminal law is one of many different forms of coming to terms with these violations and having a societal transformation. And as I've already mentioned with Bosnia, there just has not been that full societal transformation, even many, many years afterwards, because of the way in which accountability was limited and because of the way in which ethnicity was baked into the governing structures post-conflict. So I'll stop there, George.
Shelley, thank you so much. I think we'll return to some of those issues you ended with, certainly for each of our panelists. Dr. Basil, we're saying never again, but in the context of Syria, it's ongoing. What can you tell us? What can you share with your experiences of leading SAMs and also your experiences on the ground? What do you think is relevant from the Syria context to Tigray as we're talking about it today?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me for this very informative discussions. I think when it comes to Syria, never again has failed miserably, obviously. After 10 years of conflict, the anniversary was only 2 weeks ago. There were more than 500,000 civilian dead. By 2006, the UN actually stopped counting the casualties after that because they claimed there's no accurate information. There are more than 13,000 people executed in the detention centers of the regime. More than 15,000 tortured to death, documented by Caesar's pictures. Tens of thousands of women raped. And this is all documented. 100,000 of detainees are fate unknown. Many of them are feared dead under torture. This started, as you all know, with a peaceful demonstration for reforms, peaceful reforms, which was followed by calls for change of the political system. The demonstrators, the activists were encouraged by the Arab Spring that started in Tunisia, then swept through Egypt, Libya, and other Arabic countries. The Syrian regime has been in power for more than 40 years and met the demonstrations with very heavy hand, with violence. The international community was silent. For the first year, more than 5,000 peaceful demonstrators were killed with random and then sniper attacks. And this was escalated while the Western countries only showed express some condemnation, but no real action to stop the violence and enforce the law. So by the end of the year, there was more military operation trying to protect the civilians. And that led to more violence and escalation by the Assad regime and its allies in Iran and Russia. Then we saw the chemical weapon attack, widespread chemical weapon attacks against civilians. Hundreds of women and children were killed the early hours of morning in Ghouta, followed by multiple other chemical attacks. And the same thing with the response of the international community. There was widespread condemnation, but no real action to try to stop the massacres. And we at SAMS started with a small professional organization in the US. Then we responded to this crisis by sending missions, helping medical staff on the ground with treating mostly the trauma cases. And then followed that after many years of the conflict by treating the chronic illnesses. So over the years, we have provided more than 20 million medical services to the people in mostly northwestern Syria right now. Used to be also in areas outside the government controlled in Ghouta and southern Syria. But those areas have fallen to the regime. And we are regarded by the regime as a terrorist organization because we try to help the civilians. Over the years, also, we expanded our volunteer base. We have medical missions going to neighboring countries in Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, and some to northwestern Syria and Greece. I think that the key thing is, as we see it here, is if the international community is unable to respond to the early signs of crimes and violence, this will escalate rapidly, and the perpetrators will feel very comfortable committing more and more war crimes. The attacks on healthcare facilities now in Syria by the Assad regime and Russia are the norm. There are more than 930 attacks on healthcare facilities, resulting in the death of more than 900 healthcare providers. Only last Sunday, one of our hospitals in northwestern Syria, Al-Atarib Surgical Hospital, which serves 100,000 population, was attacked by laser-guided shelling, and the perpetrators even took a video of how they directed the missiles to the entrance of the underground facility to cause maximum damage and maximum casualties on the civilians, mostly civilians on the ground and healthcare providers. So the result was a death of 8 civilians, 2 children, 1 woman, and the injury of 15 personnel. One of them was a doctor, orthopedic doctor, seeing physicians in the clinic, and he lost his eye. There were 3 other nurses who are critical condition. And not only that, but the Russians also published a drone video how they targeted the missiles to that facility, the entrance, keeping in mind that that facility is in the middle of nowhere. Basically, it was transferred from another regular hospital to an underground cave, which was actually visited by CBS 60 Minutes, under construction 4 years ago. And there were basically nothing around it, no civilian or military, facilities for more than a kilometer. And we actually had shared the coordinates with the UN, which then turned them to the Russians as part of a deconfliction process, declaring those hospitals as neutral, as protected by the UN Geneva law. So even with that, looks like the perpetrators, the war criminals, are getting more and more brave and actually are publishing their crimes on social media. So I think the lesson learned from Syria here is that we need to act fast and we need to act early on. The problem is the international order is broken. Russia has vetoed any resolution to UN 14 times since 2011. The crimes are very well documented. There are more than, say, tens of thousands of videos about how demonstrators have been attacked and killed. We just talked about the drone video from the Russians themselves as a great piece of evidence. There are Caesar's pictures of people tortured to death, at least 15,000 of them, all documented, emaciated bodies with eyes missing and very clear signs of torture. Those are real humans. Some of them are children and women. This is all very well documented. The problem, how to refer the matter to the international criminal law and tribunal. This has been blocked over and over. So I think the more general question is how to reform this international order, how to enforce what we all feel as atrocities and war crimes, prevent them from going into mass atrocities and genocides. This has certainly failed in Syria. What have really was successful is the civil society and the voluntarism, as SAMS is one of the organizations, have been able to help the people on the ground, albeit with a heavy price. So thank you. Those are my most remarks related to the matter at hand.
Basil, thank you so much. So telling and still day after day happening in Syria. Oana, I think it's time to go to you with the ultimate situation of 76 years ago. We began the discussion of never again. What are the lessons you're thinking as head of one of the organizations that deals with the Holocaust? What other observations from your position in Europe do you have for the situation, and what should the good people that have joined us, what should they know?
Thank you. I'm going to start by saying that I work a lot with teachers to support them to learn about the Holocaust, but also to learn from the Holocaust and apply the lessons today. And one of the things that we know from the Holocaust and from other past atrocities is that we always try to intervene when it is too late. We try to intervene when people are already being murdered and raped and enslaved. And while it is crucial to intervene at any moment to stop it, What we really need to do is to recognize the signs that lead to it and be able to intervene much earlier. Because genocides never happen overnight. They are prepared, sometimes intentionally, sometimes unintentionally, through processes of dehumanization, stereotyping, human rights violations, and populist rhetoric that lasts for years. Racism, tribalism, hatred of any form is learned from young ages, from parents, teachers, media, and even literature and other forms of art. And the only way to combat it is through education. Unfortunately, education is usually considered a soft tool in peace building. But really, if we are being honest with ourselves, there is no other way but through education to build peaceful and inclusive societies. When there is an active genocide, we have to intervene to stop it with the means that are most time effective. But once it is stopped, there is no guarantee of lasting peace unless we engage in a purposeful process of education. Theodor Adorno said that the premier demand upon all education is that Auschwitz not happen again. He did not refer specifically to Holocaust education, but rather to all education for all subjects and all the levels. A PhD title means nothing if the person is using it to build gas chambers or incite to violence. Lack of value-based education, civic and intercultural education made most people in Europe and elsewhere bystanders during the Holocaust. And the bystander is not someone who is neutral, but someone who has taken the part of the perpetrator to his or her inaction. The most well-known stories of rescue from the Holocaust period are the stories in which individuals decided to act out of political, ideological, religious convictions, or out of a sense of empathy and connection to others, and hide Jewish people in their houses or on their properties. But more effective than these individual actions were the ones in which people organized in groups and with their complementary abilities managed to save more people. For example, by providing false paper and smuggling people across borders. Another example of effective action was the one taken by some diplomats. Notable examples are the Swedish ambassador to Hungary, the Japanese ambassador to Lithuania, the Portuguese consul in France. By issuing visas, even against the orders received by their own governments, these people helped save tens of thousands of Jews. But all these actions were not enough, because besides the direct perpetrators and their collaborators, the whole world was an accomplice. In 1938, well before the war started, representatives of 32 countries gathered in France to address the issue of Jewish refugees attempting to flee Germany. But with the exception of Dominican Republic, no country agreed to accept more Jewish refugees. Today, we cannot afford to be bystanders anymore. We have more knowledge, we have more international organizations and legal instruments, and hopefully more empathy and respect for human dignity.
Thank you so much, Juana. As an educator, and I'm sure many educators in the audience, your message is so strong for us. Alex, I want to come back to you for both some questions that have been raised in our chat and by our participants, and also questions that have been posed by, or charges really issued by our own fellow panelists. I wonder if it's possible, given the complexity of this, to talk about the precedents, the precursors. Juana said, the signs are always there, and what could be a good, succinct understanding for our audience of what happened before November 2020 that gave us signs that this was in the offing? What's the slight historic dimensions of this? Some others have raised questions about the TPLF and its role in this difficulty. And then I'd like you to turn to where the sources of intervention might be. What might we do, given the fact that Basil is obviously right, that the international order has collapsed and run away from this, what's the chances of the African Union or other interveners playing a strong role?
Thank you. My video doesn't seem to be coming on, but anyway. Oh, there we are. So let me, by way of background, let me just take that moment at which Prime Minister Abiy flew from Addis Ababa to the Eritrean capital, Asmara, nearly 3 years ago, and made peace with Eritrea. The two countries had been in a state of Cold War, first of all hot war and then Cold War for 20 years. And Eritrea, the much smaller country, had felt deeply threatened by the presence of a much larger country on its borders, with its argued hostile intent. The Ethiopians, on the other hand, said they were ready to make peace. There were one or two issues to be ironed out. Indeed, there had been authorized moves towards making peace for some years. Now, when Prime Minister Abiy went and met with Isaias and said, okay, we will implement the agreement that was made many years ago, we would have expected several things to happen. We would have expected Eritrea, which was essentially an authoritarian, well, a hyper-authoritarian, very close state, to begin to dismantle the structures of the sort of garrison state, demobilize its vast army, liberalize its political sphere, let the political prisoners out of jail, etc., etc., open up the media. None of this happened. In fact, what happened was that President Isaias said to Abiy, essentially, let's not make this into a public institutionalized peace under the auspices of the African Union, conforming with the norms and principles of peacemaking and democratization. Let's make it our personal property. Let's make it a security pact against our common enemy, the Tigrayans, the TPLF. The TPLF had been in charge, had been the dominant party in a coalition government for almost 30 years. They had voluntarily, willingly stepped out of power, but many in Ethiopia were resentful of what they saw as their disproportionate power and influence, and the way in which the coalition that they led had also repressed democracy over the years. So there was resentment against them. But the Tigrayans also had a very legitimate fear, having, as I said, willingly stepped out of being the dominant role in government, that the Eritreans had an agenda to destroy them. And it was that contributed, as well as some political mishandling and miscalculation by the Tigrayan leadership, the TPLF, to a slide to war. Wars do not happen overnight. The spark of the war was a Tigrayan attack on Ethiopian military bases, but this did not come out of nowhere. It came in the context of very much heightened tensions. And the fact that the very next day there were massive military movements across 3 of Tigray's borders indicates that this was not a surprise attack. This was in the context of this war preparations, particularly on the Eritrean side. Could have been prevented, for sure. All sides have culpabilities there. The moment it broke out, no question about who is responsible for the overwhelming majority of the violations that have been perpetrated. I think there are some in the international community who like to see Prime Minister Abiy as a reformer who was somehow blown off track. Perhaps he did have a genuine intent to democratize and reform, but if so, it is required for a political leader to have a measure of competence and a measure of strategic engagement and strategic sense in pursuing those goals. He did not have those. What about intervention? What do we do now? The United States is taking this very seriously. It is taking a lead. It has got the European Union very much on its side. It has not, thus far, it has not had success at the UN Security Council. The beginning of this month, the Irish, who are a non-permanent member of the Security Council, brought forward a debate on the situation in Ethiopia using a resolution 2417. 2417 is on armed conflict and hunger, and it empowers the UN Security Council to debate and the UN to act in a situation in which armed conflict is leading to widespread food insecurity and threatening famine. This is exactly such a case where it should have been, where it should have come into effect. The UN as an institution was not proactive, but the major problem was that a majority could not be assembled at the UN Security Council. Russia in particular was opposed to any action, saying this is a purely domestic affair. We know that China and India were also feeling much the same way, though Russia was the one leading this effort. Now, why they were able to essentially exercise this veto in the background was because the Africans did not step up. The African Union, which had its norms and principles were developed in the wake of Rwanda, the genocide in Rwanda, the war in Congo, military coup d'etat, etc., was designed precisely to stop this sort of thing from happening. It failed. The number one reason why it failed is that its headquarters are in Ethiopia, in Addis Ababa, and it was intimidated. And it did not have the leadership, a leadership with the courage and solidarity to stand up and say, stop it. It sent some envoys to try and negotiate, mediate peace negotiations. They were rebuffed. The Ethiopians succeeded in keeping their own war, their own crisis off the agenda of the African Union. And as a result, the African nations at the UN Security Council were reluctant to take a strong stand. And this has meant that the United States and the European Union are very largely going it alone. And this causes a lot of sensitivity in Africa, because the Africans don't like it when an agenda is set by former colonial powers and outside powers. So this is, and I have sympathy for that. In this case, however, the African Union, there's no question, the African Union and the African nations as a whole failed. And there's really nowhere else for this issue to go but to the zenith of the international system.
Well, thank you for that succinct analysis, but also your prescription and your analysis of where we may go in the future. I wonder, Maeza, may I come back to you? What do you see as a way forward where not only maybe larger forces, whether it's nations or civil society organizations, may be helpful in intervening, but what kind of action would you call the good folks in our audience to start to engage in that can raise the awareness, that can go action, maybe even particularly in the United States, given the role that the US may be trying to mobilize to play?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Although the core of the whole crisis is political, and although everything is happening because there is an ideological difference between the people of Tigray and the federal government that tries to have to deny the region of Tigray its right, self-determination and self-administration, innocent lives are the ones that are, bearing the burden of the conflict. There are over 4.5 million people that are facing a man-made famine. And I believe our audience today can play a role in terms of providing the much needed aid to the civilians. You can do that by supporting international NGOs and Tigray-based NGOs that are trying to do their very best with the very limited access they have to come to the rescue of the civilians. You can do that by supporting them financially or by providing ideas and projects that you think would be instrumental in terms of providing the humanitarian aid. However, the most important thing here to mention is that even if the humanitarian aid is available, even if we have the money and the food that can save these lives, unless the foreign invaders are out of Tigray, people in Tigray would not have access to this humanitarian aid. So the one action, like the one item that people can help us in terms of advocating for is the immediate withdrawal of Eritrean forces from Tigray. In addition to that, the Amhara militias also they need to leave Tigray so that the innocent lives that have lost everything they knew to be normal could breathe a fresh air of stability and peace for a while, and organizations such as HPN and others could enter to Tigray and deliver humanitarian assistance and aid to them. In addition to that, the other thing I want to mention here is there needs to be an immediate cessation of hostilities. Because if conflict continues, no matter how much humanitarian aid is delivered to Tigray, again, people will not be able to use it to save their life. In addition to that, there needs to be an immediate reconnection of Tigray. We still do not have access to majority of Tigray. Phone services only available in some parts of Tigray, mainly Mekelle. So we really don't know what exactly is happening to our family members and innocent lives in Tigray. So Tigray needs to be reconnected. The communication blackout that the federal government put on needs to be uplifted. In addition to that, there needs to be a UN-led independent investigation that looks into all the crimes, war crimes against humanity and war crimes that have been happening for the past 143 days now. This investigation needs to be led only by UN and UN only, because the current initiative that has been laid on a joint investigation by the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and the UN cannot really work for Tigrans, because as Tigrans, we feel like the Ethiopian state by itself is the problem. It's not only elements within the state that are causing the havoc and pain upon us, it's rather the Ethiopian government itself. So it cannot really um, investigate crimes. It's either facilitated to happen or committed directly. In addition to that, we have also seen how the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission is not really independent. The officials leading it are government they were appointed by the prime minister, and also they have been apologizing or justifying the suffering and pain of the people of Tigray. So for these reasons, the investigation need to be led by UN and UN only, and the audience can help us in advocating for that. First of all, by being active on Twitter. In addition to that, by calling their local representatives and ask them what exactly they're doing to stop the ongoing genocide in Tigray, Ethiopia, because collectively as global citizens we have failed the people of Rwanda in early 90s, and now we're failing the people of Tigray, either by being complicit or by not taking action. So it's very important that we play our role, because there is so much power. There is so much power and what we have to say in our voice. So do pick up the phone, call your local representatives, ask them what they're doing, push them into standing on the right side of history, and save innocent lives that are in Tigray suffering one of the atrocious conflicts that have happened in the 21st century. In addition to that, make sure to follow Omna Tigray. Omna Tigray, it's a non-profit organization that I'm a part of. It's we try to push an educated advocacy. So if you go there, you will find tools and resources that would help you to have a better understanding of the conflict, and also find ways of supporting the collective effort that we're trying to put together in order to stop the genocide. And also very important to follow HPN on all social medias as well.
Thank you so much, and thank you. I suspect you were looking at the chats, as some of us have in the Q&A. So to address the problem with the Ethiopian Human Rights Commission and its difficulties, its constraints, its ties to the government, I think is so important. Shelley, it makes me want to come back to you. You sketched for us very well the dilemma of, we have a lot of accountability history that has come out well, but also I heard you expressing the frustration that we still need to figure out a way to stop the fighting. We need a way to have real actions taken, whether it's people power or government power or international action, so that we're not left only with accountability after many are dead and the atrocities have been perpetrated. I wonder if you could share with us what you think from your study and work with prior cases. What works? What might be the kind of intervention that would work, and by whom, and under what conditions would you urge?
Thanks, George. That's the million-dollar question, I feel, since we're in the situation that's clear from this panel that we have significant weaknesses across all of our tools as the international community, within Africa itself, within those who are leading the government of Ethiopia, within the Eritrean government, with the situation as it is emerging and in the borders, and also in the United States and with the European Union. All of the major players have significant challenges right now with being able to work together collaboratively to stop the violence, to immediately allow full transparency, full access to Tigray, as it was mentioned, and to enable really very clear independent investigations. There is a broader context here, as there was in the dissolution of the former Yugoslavia. Neighbors play a critical role. The economic situation of Ethiopia and the negotiations with Sudan and Eritrea around the dam play a critical role in all of this. You really need to look at all of the dimensions of the various level of power structures and power struggle, and you need to bring other voices to the table, which is why I started with Bosnia very much as a narrow negotiation process with only those who were in power, with only those who had committed war crimes or were responsible for the violence that was taking place on all sides. And there was very little of civil society, and particularly women-led movements in the negotiation of solutions and of accountability mechanisms and of all aspects of addressing the mass atrocities and halting them. So I don't have a magic wand here, because we've just gone through Syria and what has been a colossal failure to stop mass atrocities in Syria. And what we did to stop mass atrocities in Rwanda and Bosnia have, as we've discussed, many lessons learned as well. So I'm not sure there is a magic solution other than to say really active engagement of civil society, for the extent to which the United States and the European Union do have leverage, for them to be looking to incorporate and engage different voices, different capacities, and leverage those in the negotiations and the discussions, and for very active engagement to demand transparency and access. I do think investigations, as we all know, it is one of the frustrations and one of the realities of war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And here, let me just mention that I had said ethnic cleansing is not an independent or separate international crime. It can constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity or lead to genocide. Those investigations do take time. There will be questions around the independence of the investigations. There's never just one set of investigations. Often investigations happen in multiple ways and in many mechanisms. And so that is one of the frustrations around accountability. But there are other ways to pursue forms of accountability and redress, as we know, through truth seeking, and through active engagement in peacemaking, in dialogues, in ensuring people have reparations for crimes that are committed, compensation. There are many different ways to put in place mechanisms that can help redress. And I think there's a really, a large discussion around governance that needs to take place. And in that discussion of governance with respect to Ethiopia, obviously, as I've said, you have to make sure that you have multiple voices at the table, and that takes a lot of work and a lot of community-based efforts.
Thanks so much, Shelley. That's so helpful at so many levels. Basil, I'd like to come back to you. Even with this unfolding atrocities, obviously SAMS has done some remarkable work, and I wonder if you could tell us what you see as successes from SAMS that might play a role in the Tigray case, whether that's with the medical community, diaspora. How might you assess lessons learned from your experience that might spill over to what our colleagues and what our participants are thinking about for Tigray?
Thank you for the question. It is very important. I think our experience has been unique, being a hybrid. So we are not an international relief organization trying to help people on the ground. We are a hybrid organization between medical staff on the ground, volunteers coming from the US, working together. We also hybrid in the case we have funding is 2/3, grants, international grants from the US, the UN, and Western countries, as well as private funds. So over the years, last 10 years, I believe we've collected around $140 million to help the Syrian people. 80 million of those came from grants, and 60 million came from private donations. So we are in a unique situation. We also delivering healthcare. Besides having our missions from volunteers, we have lots of online courses, like what happened with COVID situation in northwestern Syria. We established 3 large hospitals with ICUs, like 90-bed ICU, which is a major accomplishment. We trained the staff because the US and Europe were exposed to COVID before Syria. Fortunately, they gave us some time to learn from the experience and share that. And we actually have rounds on a daily basis by board-certified intensivists in the US with doctors in ICU units in Syria. So I think our experience has been really unique, but very helpful. And we learned as we went through this process, organization-wise and management-wise, donations and financials. So I think this is what I recommend, that people look at what's available on the ground, work with them, help them improve and deliver more efficient medical care, and help also with advocacy overseas. People on the ground have no way to talk to the UN, talk to Western government, talk even to the Russians. So we have been doing that, especially that we were involved in those attacks, on healthcare facilities and chemical weapons. So we really were forced into collecting evidence. This is not, I'm a gastroenterologist, our board members are all physicians, they have full-time job. But we learned through this experience, and we believe the commitment for people trying to help others has been really a unique feature, and certainly with the advocacy and online work, and we used to have lots of events on the ground. Obviously, that has been on hold since COVID, replaced by Zoom meetings and others. So I think this is really a very important way to help deliver efficient medical care in conflict zones.
That's so helpful. And, here we are with HPN for Tigray, really at its moment of creation over the last couple of months. And I think the spectrum that you've laid out and what might be possible is so true. So thank you for that. I'd like to come back to you. You gave us some great generalizations from the Holocaust situation in which, average people stepped up, a combination of embassies and others stepped up. I wonder what other lessons you would have our audience take away from your study of various experiences in Europe, where average people, like in our audience or an organization like HPM for Tigray, can be considered mobilizing for good advocacy.
I saw that there was also in the Q&A someone who mentioned this aspect, the fact that regular citizens, we want to do something, but often we don't know what to do or how to act. And I think that there is an important actor which was not mentioned yet in this discussion, and that is the media. And there's a huge difference between what we had during the Holocaust and what we have now in terms of traditional media and social media. but I think that still, we have the internet now, and we would think that that would make a huge difference. And we can see that it doesn't make a huge difference, as we can see in this case of Syria. And when the conflict in Syria started, there was a lot of interest and a lot of reporting in the media, and people posted about it on social media. But then, the days went by and the years went by, and there's not so much interest now, and people move to other things. So I think it is important to find ways to keep the conflict in the attention of the people, and what HPN is doing with this campaign, I think it's very important. And when it comes to regular citizens, and when we have this feeling that we would like to do something, but we don't know what to do. I mentioned earlier the importance of organizing, of bringing people together in groups and use our complementary abilities. And when we feel helpless, I think it's important to talk to other people, preferably live, but on social media, it works as well. The problem with social media is that it might give us the illusion that we are doing something because we post once or twice about it, and then it doesn't really have an impact if we don't follow up, and if we don't raise awareness and bring this to the attention of more people who can organize and who can come up with new ways and creative ways to address this, and to push their governments and push the international organizations to intervene in a more effective way.
I couldn't have think of a better kind of message, Juana. The notions that even at one's moment of feeling lost, or what can I do, we've got to do this in the context of community. We've got to reach out to one another and sustain one another, even in the darkest moments. And Basil gave us some examples of that as well. I think this has been an incredibly rapid 90 minutes. I appreciate Alex and others answering on the chat some of the questions that have been posed to us by the audience, and we've got to many of them, but not all of them, which sparks us to know that the dialogue should continue. But in fairness to the time we pledged to you as an audience, I'm going to call on Jonathan and Dr. Rashan to close us out, to remind people of the people power you do have, the ways in which we have a lot of tasks to engage in if we're going to advance not only the knowledge base and awareness, but advocacy on the behalf of the besieged people in Tigray. And so I'd like to invite them to, if you will, come to the virtual podium and find a way to give us a kind of closing message and an action orientation to go from here.
Yes. Thank you for Professor George Lopez for moderating and leading this important, delicate, and yet pressing conversation. The topic of genocide is obviously heavy and triggering, but we must talk about it to ensure it never happens again. I also want to thank the panelists for lending us your expertise and your time. Lastly, thank you for the attendees, and I hope you walk away today with more knowledge and more desire to take action. As you heard throughout our discussion, it has been over 70 years since the UN and the international community declared never again. Yet here we are. So I do want to close out by the words of Dr. Tedros Adhanom, the director of the WHO. He posted on social media last week, stating that Syria is one of many crises around the world, from Myanmar to Yemen and Tigray, where millions of people have been denied access to essential health services, and where health facilities have been destroyed and health workers have been intimidated. This must stop. Health Professionals Network for Tigray is fighting for exactly that. Being nonprofit, non-religious, and non-partisan, Health Professionals Network for Tigray is fighting to end the death and suffering of civilians. And we challenge you to stand with us and help us demand the UN and international community fulfill their responsibility to protect civilians from mass atrocities, tyranny, and genocide. I want to fast forward to our demands and remind our demands as Health Professionals Network for Tigray to our audiences. We are calling on the United Nations and other responsible governmental agencies to end hostilities and protect civilians. We're asking to reconnect Tigray. Regardless of the claim, access has been allowed. As you recall, 80% of Tigray remains inaccessible and in blackout. And we call for allowing unhindered, unrestricted humanitarian access. Last but not least, as you heard it reiterated more and more time and time again throughout our discussion, we call for UN-led independent investigation into mass atrocities and human rights violations to hold perpetrators accountable. These are the 3 ways to get involved with HPN for Tigray, as you see on the screen. But I want to remind our audiences the call to action for today. We ask you to make an impact today. We ask you to stand with us. Please, again, tweet, go to Twitter app and follow HPN for Tigray, where you will find a link with multiple tweets. And it will take you to Omna page as well, where you will find multiple tweets with the hashtag #NeverAgain for Tigray campaign for the upcoming 24 hours. This is how you can make an impact. And this is the multiple ways of getting involved with HPN for Tigray. I thank you everyone for this great event, and thank you our panelists again for your expertise in sharing your time with us today. Jonathan, do we have anything with this slide then?
No, this is it. Thank you so much, everyone. Again, I think we've obviously learned a lot today, but knowledge without action is wasteful. So I would say continue to engage. Every tweet, every like, or you writing letters or calling your representative certainly will bring about action. So I would just urge you to continue to do that and engage in our conversation. Thank you all.